Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good evening. I am John O'Brien, Head of Communications. Welcome to MCC Brussels for tonight's discussion, Empire of Law, the European Union's March Beyond Democracy. Since its earliest days, from the European communities to today's European Union, the project of integration has been propelled by a built-in dynamic, competency extension, and ever greater centralisation. As the old quip goes, riffing on Einstein, European integration is like riding a bicycle. You either keep moving or you fall off. Over time, this has produced what critics called integration by stealth, and what many scholars, including our first speaker, describe as competence creep. Competence creep refers to the ways in which the European institutions expand their authority beyond what the treaties explicitly confer. This happens not through open political debate or democratic treaty change, but through reinterpretation of the treaties, judicial activism by supranational courts, administrative initiative from the European Commission, and an act first, argue later approach to crisis management. The European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, and a growing constellation of European agencies and aligned non-governmental organizations have all played a part in extending the Brussels rulebook. Meanwhile, concepts intended as safeguards, subsidiarity, conferral of competencies, and even the rule of law have in practice been used to justify further centralization. Subsidiarity became an argument for acting at the European level. European Union competencies ballooned into areas never envisaged by national governments. And the rule of law increasingly became a tool to challenge rather than protect member states resisting overreach. Perhaps the European Union's most remarkable achievement is that it has steadily centralized power while continuing to present itself as an organization committed to limiting it. Tonight we ask, are member states still masters of their own laws, or has the European Union evolved into a self-perpetuating political machine? And is there any realistic route for powers to return from Brussels back to national democracies? To explore these questions, we are privileged to host three distinguished speakers. Dr. Philip Signat, Deputy Research Director at MCC Brussels and author of the new report, European Union Competence Creep, Pushing Supranationalization Beyond Democratic Legitimacy. That report you can read on our website or by clicking on the QR code that's in the handout on your seat with you tonight. We'll then hear from Michael von der Schulenburg, member of the European Parliament, a strong critic of technocratic overreach and an advocate for parliamentary sovereignty. And finally, Boglarta Boya, Ministerial Commission in Hungary's Ministry of the European Union Affairs, responsible for sovereignty reform, and former Deputy State Secretary for the European Union Relations. But before we hear from our speakers, I'm going to ask the Executive Director of MCC Brussels, Frank Furedi, to say a few words to you about tonight's meeting.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. At first, I wasn't really sure whether we should have a meeting on this topic. And then I realized that actually a lot of people are not really familiar with the whole idea of competency. And I recall a conversation I had with my wife. And I told my wife we're having a meeting on competency creep. And she said, why is that a problem? The EU is so incompetent of everything they do that you would think a bit of competency would be a good thing. And I had to explain that that's not exactly what we're talking about here. But basically, the only point I want to make in the couple of minutes that I'm here is we really got to watch the language that we use. The language that we use and we accept as normal is very often highly ideological and very often obscures what is really at stake. And that's something that it seems to me is really, really quite important. I noticed, for example, that my colleague John used the expression member state. Now, what's wrong with the term member state? Anybody? Or member nations, or whatever. The problem is that the minute you use the word member state or member nations, which is the favorite expression that is used in EU circles, what you're doing is you're obscuring the fact that the EU, the European Union, used to be composed of nation states. There's a world of difference between a nation state, which implies sovereignty, it implies independence, and a member state, which elides the distinction between independence and being part of an institution. Because the minute you have member states, you no longer have an international institution. It's no longer an international institution. It becomes something of a quasi-empire, and that's often forgotten. And I could give you, every Saturday night, when you're out having a nice social time, you're going to parties, I sit at home and I make lists. It's one of my addictions. And I've been making lists of all the terms that are used in the European bubble that we shouldn't be using. One of the terms that comes out of this expression of member states, which is very much linked to the idea of competency, is the idea of shared sovereignty. Now just think for a second, shared sovereignty. It sounds really beautiful, doesn't it? But then, how can you share sovereignty? It's like sharing your wife, right? Something very interesting happens, right? Shared sovereignty basically is not something that keeps sovereignty intact. Because the beautiful thing about sovereignty is that sovereignty is exactly not something you share. This is your sovereignty as a nation. And the minute that we introduce these little terms of shared sovereignty and others, then something very interesting happens. Because what does shared sovereignty mean? Does that mean that you can be sovereign, genuinely sovereign on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday? But on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, you share what was only yours to begin with. What does that really mean? What it really means, at the end of the day, what shared sovereignty means is that people here in Brussels get to decide what sovereignty actually means. And for them, sovereignty no longer means what it used to. It basically means the very antithesis of that. It basically means that your independence as a nation becomes compromised forever, irrevocably. And the EU Brussels oligarchy gets to decide what is it that you can do for yourself in your nation state and where we can make decisions about how you lead your life at home. And that really takes us back to the question of competency. So the one thing I would ask all you to do, including my colleagues, watch the language, listen to the words, and don't use the words that they use, because if you do that, then we become ideologically captured by precisely the wrong kind of people. So enjoy tonight. It's going to be a great event.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Boglaka and MEP von der Schulenburg. Good evening. I had the pleasure over the past weeks and months to take a somewhat closer look at what Frank has described and what John has introduced as the competence creep. So I'll be the first to speak. It's going to be to some extent technical. I hope I'm not going to lose you before the two other speakers are going to give their remarks. I'll focus on the European Court of Justice. The European Union was set up by intergovernmental treaties that balance supranational integration with national sovereignty and in some states regional autonomy. And it centralized the protection of national identities and interests in a common European house, free of wars. Over the decades, however, the supranational institutions created by the treaties have systematically pushed for continuous integration and centralization, and they have resorted to competence creep to circumvent treaty limitations. This has upset the balance that the states wanted, and it has rendered the EU more fragile. The European Court of Justice plays a particularly important role in this and has a long track record of what's called centralization bias. It developed a number of judicial doctrines that severely limit the effectiveness of some fundamental treaty principles. First and foremost, the principle of conferral, which is the EU's most basic building block. It is the states that created the European Union, not the other way around. Conferral is the most basic building block of this. In doing so, the court has, as well as the European Commission, contribute to the declining functionality, acceptance, and legitimacy of the European Union as a whole, as has become evident, for instance, with Brexit. The Council, for its part, to share the blame, has not only been unsuccessful in its attempts to install backstops against competence creep at treaty level, but also contributes to competence creep by placing political communication over decision. The steady repetition of the ever closer union phrase has been turned into a judicial dogma by the European Court of Justice, with effects beyond the Council's aims. And the Council's more recent tendency to delegate decisions to the Commission instead of negotiating a compromise itself increases the problem of competence creep. So I'll focus on the European Court of Justice and the impact of its decisions on the principles that the EU was built on. And I'll do so focusing on two principles. There are many more than this, but two principles which I consider to be very basic and necessary for the proper functioning and existence of the European Union. One is conferral, and the other is subsidiarity. So the principle of conferral means that the states who concluded the treaties and adapted the treaties over the decades wrote into those treaties what competencies they want to give to the supranational level and which competencies they want to retain at the national level. There's also the mixed competency where the European Union institutions can become active if the states do not become active in a certain policy field. But in essence, it's a distribution of competencies in those treaties that is decided by the states who signed the treaties and, as the United Kingdom has shown, can also exit those treaties. To this, the European Court of Justice has very soon begun to oppose a judicial activism, or at least an interpretation of the treaties, which limits and over time very much reduces the principle of conferral. And the first such decision, and you see that this is a very long tradition in a way of the European Court of Justice. The first such decision is Fédération Charbonnière, which is a decision from July 1956, so that's really early on. And in this, the European Court of Justice holds that the rules, what was back then the ECSC Treaty, the European Community of Steel and Co., automatically, quote, presuppose the rules without which that treaty would have no meaning or could not be reasonably and usefully applied. This is then the doctrine of implied powers, which means that if you put something into the treaty and the supranational administration decides that or argues that in order to fulfill the mission in those treaties, they need to have additional competencies to follow these, to realize these aims, it is implied in the treaties that they have competencies which are not written in the treaties. And again, this is 1956, so we have something like 7 decades of tradition on that one. A second early decision, and this is one which I suppose all students of European affairs have heard 50 times, is the decision Costa Enel of July 1964. And this is a decision in which the court, so we are now moved on to the next level of treaty, the EEC, European Economic Community. The decision of Costa Enel states that the supranational law would supersede national law. And since the treaty established also the European Court of Justice, the decisions by the European Court of Justice would supersede those of any national court. And you can see where this is going to lead to a clash with not just national administrative courts, civil courts, but also with national constitutional courts. In any case, this came known as the doctrine of primacy. So you have the implied powers, the competencies that are not written in the treaties grow over time into the treaty system, and the doctrine of primacy, which means that EU law supersedes national law. Finally, at least in this short list here, the Handelsgesellschaft decision of 1970. Here the European Court of Justice upheld the supremacy of EU law, even when colliding with national constitutional law. And this is the first time that it produced a counter-movement by, in this case, the German Constitutional Court, in the first so-called Solange ruling, where the court stated, the National Constitutional Court stated that they remain the ultimate arbiter of, in this case, the respect of fundamental rights, not the European Court of Justice. And this is not going to be the topic of the talk, but you can see it if you want to in the report. There have been collisions all over between not just the German Constitutional Court, but several constitutional courts in Europe and the European Court of Justice, right up until most recent years, and this is going to continue, I suppose. So that's for the principle of conferral. Now the principle of subsidiarity. Also, quickly, 3 landmark decisions. The first is from 1979, the Cassis de Dijon, and here the court established the principle of mutual recognition. This is also one that students of EU Affairs have heard, I think, several times. The point is that if something is put on one national market, it cannot be excluded from any other national market, barring very few exceptions. And this was then built on in a further decision in 1986, and here comes the notion of rule of law. So it's from the single market moving to the rule of law. And the court argues that the notion of rule of law is fundamental to the entire European Economic Community. And it ranked in this decision the European Economic Community Treaty as, quote unquote, constitutional. So you have a serious movement in which the European Court of Justice states that European law would have constitutional level, which none of the states ever did. And it's not in the treaties. So this is the shift in which subsidiarity was first considerably limited, damaged, if you want to see it that way. Secondly, and this is not really a classical decision, but it's a fight that the European Court of Justice started with the European states, not on EU matters, but on the European Free Trade Agreement, which includes non-EU states as well. And as most international trade agreements, the EFTA agreement also included an arbitration court. And there was the risk of the collision between the interpretation of the EFTA court and the interpretation of the European Court of Justice on items of the 2 treaties that are identical in wording. So we'd have conflicting obligations by the member states if the EFTA court and the European Court of Justice held different opinions on an issue. And this is the main reason why the European Court of Justice immediately killed this project. And what's interesting here is the wording with which it did this, because it argued that all future community action might have to contribute to making concrete progress towards, quote unquote, European Union. So this is 1986, this is before the European Union in name was established. It's still the European communities back then. And the European Court of Justice pronounced additionally, first, that the European states would have an obligation to progress towards an ever closer union, and second, that the European Court of Justice itself had an obligation to enforce EU law to that specific end. So the ever closer union, which has been in the preamble of every EU treaty since the 1950s and 60s, has been taken by the European Court of Justice to be a line of direction, a dogma, which it declared itself to follow from then on. I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip the third one and maybe have it for the discussion. In any case, the perspective is that future European Court of Justice rulings are almost certain to produce more and more, let's call them face-offs, with national constitutional courts, which means that you are going to have a political fight which is being fought in judicial fora, which is a mismatch. And you are going to have a considerable, let's say, a conversation between the European Court of Justice and the national constitutional courts, which is going to become more and more tense. And this is going to potentially immobilize the European decision-making, but also decision-making on the national level in areas where such conflicts exist. Ultimately, you have to solve them politically. So this is going to be a hindrance for policy-making also. So to conclude, there is the confrontation between those courts risks to destabilize the EU as a whole. There is a manifest risk that the European Court of Justice and Commission fall into a defense of values that destroys the very thing that they claim to protect. Because in this perspective, you're going to have a rule of law which is very diffuse, unclear, and is going to limit and reduce the rule of law and the visibility of your obligations instead of increasing them, which should be the aim. The political author and poet Bertolt Brecht, famous for his three-penny opera, once quipped about democracy: all power comes from the people, but where does it go? In as complex a system as the European Union with its multi-level governance, the question seems hard to answer. But it is currently clear that it has diffused to an extent which makes democratic control over political decisions exceedingly hard, and the EU is in need of a considerable overhaul. In the medium term, possible remedies to the situation include limiting supranational competence creep by abandoning the practice of using administrative procedure as ersatz legislation. That concerns the Commission. It can be limited by adding appropriate protocols to the European treaties that rein in over centralisation, the centralisation bias of the court, and that is the job of the Council to do. And finally, by stopping the European Court of Justice from reshaping the treaties, by placing its corresponding rulings under the proviso of the Council. So for fundamental decisions, the Council should be the deciding body and not the European Court. In the long term, treaty reform is unavoidable, but this is something which has been said over probably since year one. However, we are at a point where it is probably a question of continued existence of the EU to have proper treaty reform. Such a reform has to recalibrate the EU's multi-level governance system by fundamentally curtailing the supranational institutions' reach, by replacing interstate cooperation at the heart of it, and by rebooting the entire body of EU norms, and this is going to be the biggest challenge, I think, by rebooting the entire body of EU norms in the same way that France did in 1804 with the Code Napoleon, and that Germany did in 1900 with the new civil code. It seems to me that the only alternatives to doing this are either further national exits from the European Union or an unraveling of the EU itself. Thank you.
Michael? Michael?
Yeah. Oh, it's good. Shall I stand there? Okay.
Like to.
I will. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Michael Schönburg. I have a very different life than most of you. I've spent 34 years in war countries for the UN, from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sierra Leone. I can't even remember them all. So my whole life my thinking is very much focused on war and peace. And that's also why I'm here in the parliament. The second thing I want to say is I'm coming from a very different political party, but I wanted to thank you for inviting me. I'm a strong believer in cross-party cooperation. We might not agree on many other things, but there are things we will agree. And one of the things is that we are concerned for where the European Union goes. You know, we have seen the European Union, especially during the war in Ukraine, having taken competencies on that has never been agreed in any treaties. When we see, for instance, what the recent readiness roadmap or defense readiness movement or whatever, I mean, you have things in it which I think belongs to NATO, but now we do this and we spend a lot of money on these things. So I think we have a union that has sort of delinked itself from their countries and has taken their own rights and taken. One of the reasons is that I've always asked myself, why are European leaders doing something which is so obviously against the interest of their citizens? The war in Ukraine is not in the interest of the European Union citizens, because we lose our cheap energy, we lose our economic on raw materials we get from Russia, we have now a problem with China. I mean, all the things Europe can't do. I mean, according to the study in 2050, the European Union will be only 4.5% of the world population, and the GDP they produce will only be 9% of the rest of the world. So we are actually a quite small entity, even if we think that we are very large, which has something to do, when we go to school, we have always Europe in the middle, and it looks much larger than all the rest of the world. But it has to dawn on us that this time is over, and we have to realize who we are, and what we can do as a European Union, and what we can do as single states. What worries me most is they see that we are trying to build an empire. We are empire building. We have this dream which will never come true that we want. We had recently the opposition leader from Belarus in the parliament who said, yeah, very soon when I win the elections, I will belong to the EU. We had the so-called prime minister of Greenland of 56,000 people. He is the prime minister. He says also he wants to be in the EU and be a whole club, and we want to have a Europe that goes from the Black Sea to the Atlantic and then from the Mediterranean to the North Pole. It will not happen. It is dreams which are breaking down, and they're breaking down especially because of the Ukraine war that we are losing. We have to come to terms that we are losing this war, and we have to adjust to these things. But this empire building has also created a situation where the smaller these member states don't play a role. And here I might have to maybe contradict you a little bit on the member states. I wasn't thinking of sharing my wife, actually, but I'm coming from the UN, and in the UN Charter we speak about equal sovereignty. We're not speaking about sharing wives or not. We're speaking of equal sovereignty. That means it must be all for equal. And if we are here subsumed, and if we give up the unanimity principle of decision-making in foreign policy and defense policy, we basically break a UN Charter requirements that all states should be equal, non-interference in the internal affairs of a country. I've just had a discussion with Georgia where the EU insists that they adopt the EU foreign and security policy, which means an anti-Russian policy, which is from their geographical point doesn't make any sense. It makes maybe also no sense for Hungary. I mean, there are countries which have their own foreign policy and they have to maintain it. By bringing this all in, we basically create something which is a failure, because I think if we continue like this one, the European Union is going to end up as a failure. Now, it is therefore not only the competencies, but it's also how the European Union does things. We have just issued a legal opinion, which was done by a former judge of the European Court of Justice and a senior lawyer, which we looked at the sanctions against individuals. One little part of it, like many other things, no? The sanctions against individuals. And they came up, they looked at these sanctions, how they are created against the European law and international law. And there is a list of 9 issues where this contradicts the law. That means the European Union, by having centralized, by becoming this, I would call it almost a monster here, creates its own shape, doesn't even bother about its own laws anymore, its own in international law. They just do these things because they feel there's nobody they have to answer to. And that's and I have this report here. I will distribute this here. That's the summary. There were 12 of them, and there's also where you can find it. So whoever is interested, this is in a very professional made study where we see that this sort of centralization we have seen creates a political environment inside the European Union that doesn't even apply its own laws, not to speak about the other things. But there is a much deeper thing. When you work in war countries and countries come out of war, one of the things is what you do with power, the distribution of power or separation of power. And one of the arguments we always made, because mostly when you come out of a war, you redesign the constitution. Because the constitution, these countries are different to ours. When you come out of a war, a constitution is a peace treaty. And we always argue, you have to keep separation of power. Power should not be always in one hand. You know, judicial power, legal power, the power to make laws, the power to implement, and the judicial power. This doesn't exist in this study. I mean, the interesting thing is that it is the Council of the European Union that makes the law. It's the Council of the European Union, very often at ambassador level or lower, who decides who is a guilty person and against whom we implement sanctions. And in the Treaty of Lisboa, any legal action against something which comes from the foreign foreign and security policy you cannot bring to the European Court of Justice. That means you have the one body makes all the decisions, and you can't even challenge it. We have it here. So I think what we go in a world, in a European Union, where we see also economic sanctions that hurt us probably more than Russia. We have also sanctions against individuals that hurts us more on our democracy, because in the end, also this is against what we stand for, because the separation of power is one of the pillars of democracy, and it's not implemented in a body who now behaves more and more as if it's a super state. It comes, of course, when they were still an international organization. So this whole thing is in a flux, and I think we have all to think now what type of European Union we want to have. And I tell you, the most dangerous things in the world now are intrastate wars. It's not wars like we have it now in Ukraine. Most of the wars, most of the killing, most of the refugees happen because you have interstate wars which can last for 70 years. I mean, for 70 years, I have a lot to deal with these type of things. And therefore, we need functioning states. The only way we will prevent in the future, also in Europe, to have armed conflicts within our own countries among communities, for whatever reason, however they are organized, I don't want things, is that we need functioning states. And I think this huge body of the European Union as it's designed now, and where we hand over more and more power to them without even any proper treatment, I think is a thing of failure. So we are talking here not only about whether we like it or we don't like it. We talk also about what is our security for the future. Europe, because of its history, will only survive if we build it on our diversity. Our diversity is our strength. We are not the United States, which had a civil war for 4 years in order to create one state, which was then very small and didn't have any transition. We have traditions. So we need a European Union which observes the diversity among states, and therefore decision-making has to be at the lowest level possible, not even only on a state level, but also regional level, and things like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did I pass the line?
Dear Director Furedi, dear Frank, dear Deputy Director, distinguished member of the European Parliament, honorable guests, dear ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank MCC for organizing this conference. It is indeed very timely, and why so? From time to time, an ambitious but fundamentally flawed vision resurfaces in the European political debate, and this is the idea of building a United States of Europe. While this concept may appear appealing to some, Europe's constitutional architecture and historical experiments both show that forced political unification has always come at the expense of national democracy and legitimate diversity. And it carries an unavoidable risk, the gradual erosion of national sovereignty through a creeping expansion of power, seeking to push back member states' competencies, imposing political and financial pressure, and introducing selective oversight mechanism. Today, efforts to build the United States of Europe are stronger than ever. But how do we get to this point? First, we spoke about myth. Many political myths shape the European Union, but one of the most enduring one is maybe the myth of the ever closer union. According to this myth, deeper integration is not only desirable, but inevitable, actually a process, an irreversible process that is embedded in the very DNA of the European institutions. It suggests that the Union must always move towards greater centralization, regardless of its member states and citizens. And those who dare to question this dogma are often dismissed as Eurosceptic and anti-European, when in reality they are only seeking to defend the very foundation of the European cooperation. The sovereignist position begins with a simple but fundamental truth. States of the European Union are the masters of the treaties and the architects of Europe's future. They are the sole constitutional actors empowered to confer, limit, or withdraw competencies. And this principle is not a political opinion, it is the very foundation of the Union constitutional identity. They originally created the European Union as a framework for economic cooperation. We know that, to exercise certain competencies jointly or through common institutions whenever collective action proved to be more efficient than acting alone. In this understanding, sovereignty doesn't vanish at the European level, it's merely exercised together by consent and by choice. Therefore, it follows that only member states, as the original source of sovereignty, have the right to decide which powers can be shared and which must remain their own. Also, in the last decade, crisis has often been used to justify far-reaching policy instruments adopted without real regulatory assessment or sunset clauses, some of European jargon I'm using sometimes, and without any democratic scrutiny. And this pattern has turned exceptional measures into permanent political tools. Migration, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the loss of competitiveness, inflation, and economic slowdown, they have all tested the resilience of Europe. Yet, time and time again, it seems that instead of providing pragmatic solutions, Brussels has used this crisis as a pretext to accumulate power more and centralize decision-making further. So step by step, we have seen efforts to shift decision-making away from member states to an EU level, eroding the balance of the treaties and narrowing the room for sovereign choices. So where do we draw the dividing line between EU and nation-state competencies? In light of the past decade, this question is becoming more important than ever. Well, we in Hungary had already recognized the alarming trend during the conference on the future of Europe. I don't know whether you remember in 2021 and 22, where the Union's selective approach to certain member states became evident, despite being among the most active participants. We organized more than 800 conferences and submitted over 2,000 contributions. Hungary's proposals were just effectively excluded for the official dialogue. And this obviously, for us, undermined the credibility of what should have been an open and citizen-driven process. A conference intended to deepen democracy ended up narrowing the spectrum of acceptable views. Only 6 member states saw their national discussion formally acknowledged, while Hungary's valuable input was dismissed without explanation. Actually, among our proposals were many forward-looking, and actually many figure in the MCC Great Reset report. For example, the creation of a catalogue of competencies and a competence court, a transparent framework that would clearly define the limits of the EU authority and prevent future overreach. And this is not about limiting Europe, this is about legal clarity, institutional discipline, and restoring mutual trust. So to this end, this time the government of Hungary has launched a systematic review of the European Union competencies. The purpose of the competence review is to examine the competence script in the following fields: energy, economic policy, rule of law, migration, and education, culture, and family policy. Our aim is to assess whether competencies are genuinely shared as intended, to understand why the existing safeguards for member states actually they fail in practice, and we will also propose practical solutions to restore the balance and protect national sovereignty within the European framework. And it is a particular honor for me that the task is implemented under my coordination as Ministerial Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, let me briefly touch upon one specific area where we already have begun our investigation, and this is rule of law. Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union stipulates, the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. And let me emphasize, Hungary fully shares the values of Article 2 of the TU. Our concerns is not with the values themselves, but with the way they are increasingly used as a political instruments through one-sided political interpretation rather than objective principles. Under the banner of protecting values, Brussels has constructed a political mechanism that exerts pressure on member states with double standards while evading the treaty limits. Since 2003, this toolkit has grown step by step. Several instruments operate in the legal gray zone. They are not foreseen in the treaties nor in secondary legislation. And their practical use risks replacing treaty-based procedure with ad hoc political practices like the rule of law report of the Commission. Other tools may have a legal basis, but they are used in practice that obviously goes against the treaty. For example, the rule of law condition to regulation meant to protect the EU budget, but it has been applied to clearly unrelated matters, including Hungarian universities' participation in Erasmus and Horizon programs. And then there is the famous Article 7 procedure. It has a legal basis, but in practice it became a tool of political coercion, basically openly used to influence national politics. The European Parliament's current rapporteur, it's a never-ending saga, recently admitted that the process is about elections and that the right institutional decisions could even change the government of Hungary. And meanwhile, there is an utter silence about the rule of law standards within the EU institutions themselves, but let us recall Article 2 binds them just as much as it binds EU member states. Last year's Hungarian EU presidency put this issue on the agenda, but we ran into stiff resistance from the institutions. You wonder why. Ladies and gentlemen, if we fail to draw a clear line between national and European competencies, if we cannot say this is enough, then the original balance and the noble vision of the founding fathers will be lost, and integration will no longer serve the nations, but ultimately absorb them. And the federalist plan will work. United States of Europe will become a natural and inevitable outcome of the European integration. But we must recall the lessons of history. The strength of Europe has always come from its nations, from our traditions, our sovereignty, and from our will to cooperate freely. Hungary will not remain a spectator to this transformation. Europe must never become a place where unity replaces freedom. We have to take back the control of the European cooperation, and it is not against Europe, but this is for Europe. Let us restore the promise of Europe of nations. Together we are stronger than alone, while remaining who we are. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. For those of you familiar with MCC Brussels, a very important part of our evening is questions and comments from the audience. And I'm going to invite you now to say something bold, say something brief, and say something brilliant. Brief being very important. But we would like to get in as many voices as possible. If you have a question for the panel, if you have a particular viewpoint, we'd like to hear from you. I'm going to start with this gentleman over here. Please stand up. Yes. And wait until the microphone comes to you. Yes.
I'm Andrej Dostal, one of the members of European Parliament. The word member is, I think, not a problem, because you have no right to become member of something, which is good for the accession states to know. But on the other hand, you have no duty to remain members, which is important to us. So membership is okay. But the important thing is autonomy, that we can exit any time. And now I have not a legal but factual question. Okay, our constitution doesn't allow Czech Republic to transfer our sovereignty to someone else. So at some point we would have to not apply the European law if they went too far, and the European court would say we have to apply it. So what would happen? As far as I know, at this point, European Union doesn't have any army. So how would they force a member state to do something which, according to the sovereign ideas of the state, doesn't conform to European law?
Got it. Thank you very much. This gentleman back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Zheng Yu. I'm from the Mission of China to the European Union. Just now, Commissioner Bolia have mentioned the word crisis several times. And this reminds me that I once read from former President of the European Union, Mr. Herman Van Rompuy. He once said that in time of crisis, there's always a concentration of power, and someone have to make decisions. So in the past 3 years, I have witnessed the tremendous drive and efforts from the European Union in integration of its defense industry and relevant defense efforts. So I have a question for the panelists. Would you be worried that this integration of defense industry will steaming new power into the concentration of power and not on the opposite direction? Thank you very much.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I really welcome this discussion on how the European Union works, but I think as well that the reason why we're here tonight is because we don't really agree with the type of laws that are voted in the European Parliament. So I think we should not forget that even if the European Union was working in a different, more democratic way, if it was still voting the same laws it is voting today, we'd still be talking here tonight, because at the end of the day, that's what we don't really agree on. I wouldn't be here if the European Union was voting laws that was agreeing on, no matter the way that it works. I don't know if you would agree with me or not, so basically I just want to make the difference between the way that the European Union works and the substance of the laws that are voted. And I think the second part is the most important one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the panel here. Philip, would you like to take any of those questions?
Certainly. Yeah, maybe I'll just take the last one that was put on the conflict between, let's call it, content and procedure of lawmaking. I would put more emphasis on a well-functioning procedure, transparent and accountable procedure, rather than the content of the laws. If there would be, let's say, if we'd have all the same opinion and laws would be decided by some very shady procedure, but we'd like the outcome, I think this is less preferable than to having things we disagree with, but a proper procedure. Because majorities, preferences change. There's also debate and arguments, so people have one position one day, perhaps convinced by good arguments to change their position. So we need to maintain the space for this type of conversation. And the decision-making 10 years from now is different than today. The content, the zeitgeist, if you will, is going to be different, as it is different today than it was 10, 20, 50 years ago. And I think in that regard, it's more important to have proper procedures with accountability and transparency than to have preferred outcomes through bad procedures.
Well, Glárka, I feel that you maybe are best positioned to be able to answer the question as how a country could be forced to do something that they do not want to do, being the target of many such initiatives.
And I'm very proud, actually, to say that we don't do that. And we are cited in front of the court, and we are punished, actually. For example, for the migration, you know, maybe you are aware that because we protect our border and because we don't let migrants, illegal migrants in, and because we do the pre-screening, basically now we are fined for 2 million euro, and we pay 1 million euro per day as a penalty. But we think that this is an investment for future and national security, so we are not going to, basically.
But there certainly is lots of punishments available for those who do want to follow their own nation states' desires, yes?
Yes, well, we can. I briefly mentioned the rule of law procedures. I mean, this is basically the most powerful tool of competence creep, and this has become the most powerful tool of competence creep, apart from obviously how the crisis basically evolved to centralize more and more power and decision making. But the rule of law procedure is what I called a rule of law jihad. Sorry for this definition, but basically this is used against sovereign countries. This is I can say that it's a war on the sovereignist countries, and this is waged. It is waged by this rule of law instrument, because the rule of law basically it became a political weapon, a political tool, a political weapon to punish nation states, they didn't want to follow what Brussels dictate to them.
Michael, when it comes to the defense question as well, you've been in many parts of the world where there's been serious conflict. This integrated defense strategy, is that the right way to go for Europe, do you think?
No, it's of course not. I mean, in the end, defense is to get along with your neighbor and negotiate some sort of how do you live together. It's this whole idea that you have only peace when you prepare for war. I think it's. I wrote a whole paper on this whole thing, which I think is counter the UN Charter. But I wanted to, if you don't mind, to say something else. You know, there's a lot of what we do in the Parliament, whether we're happy with the way we go. Why don't we change the question? And that's also why I felt so happy to be invited here, because we have to answer the question, what type of Europe we want to live for in the future to. That is the real answer to the things. We can say that if I sit there in the Parliament and we have these laws, and I ask myself, why do we actually have this law? Why should I decide on these things? No? But we have no counter proposal. What does it look? Somehow we have to live in Europe, and there must be some sort of coordination. But what does it look like? I don't think there is a vision. And I'm sitting here in this Parliament from completely outside. I have no clue about the EU and this Parliament. I'm often shocked what I see there. But anyway, but we can't. I don't see the chance in the Parliament that parliamentarians from different parties put their differences aside and say, listen, it's very important what type of Europe we will have in the future. And I think we will not have much time for it. Because if the Ukraine war is lost, and it's going to be lost, our elites will have no plan what to do in this case.
Okay.
They have no plan. And we have to, there is a time when we have to rethink Europe. The present foreign and security policy is a failure. I mean, it's already today a failure, and it will become an obvious failure. So we have to think what of a Europe we want to have in the future.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I'm going to take this gentleman here.
My dimension too much.
This gentleman here.
I think it is.
I'll come to you in a minute.
So let me ask the question directly. Why don't we adopt the Swiss model, where you delegate bottom up, and you only leave some competences at the top level that are really important for everybody, but most of it is at the bottom. And I think it's no coincidence that Switzerland is also not part of the European Union.
Thank you.
We're thinking about it, unfortunately.
Okay, we're going to take a question here from this gentleman at the front.
Thank you. My general remark is to the three presentations is that it is a diagnosis, but there's no therapy proposed. So I would invite you to say what to do with it.
That's very good.
First, but the problem is that it's systemic, which you call competence creep. A few comments. First, on subsidiarity, which was very strongly mentioned by Dr. Zickert, there were proposals how to deal with it. I'm one of the 6 negotiators of the new treaty accepted by the Parliament, presently advisor to Polish President on EU affairs. And there were 2 proposals. First, to create subsidiarity chamber within the ECJ, which could undermine or question the verdicts of, probably in line with the Karlsruhe and other courts, which you did mention. There are 9 of them, by the way. So I would invite to reflect further on. My second remark is I'm trying to challenge the speakers.
Okay.
Very often it is being quoted and referred to the ever closer union as a target you shoot at. But you forget the whole sentence. It's ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. It is not ever closer union of the states. So misinterpretation of what is in the treaty leads to the abuse. But we, critics, we repeat this abuse. It is peoples of Europe coming closer by incremental societal processes, but not by merging states, turning them into Länder, and creating a European state. My third remark is a shared competence, which you referred to. And either I misunderstood, if so, I'm sorry, but I think that you said that these are the competences which belong to the member states and where union can step in. It is the other way around. If you read the treaty, shared competence is not very much different from the exclusive competence of the union. It says that EU may exploit 100% of this competence, 50%, none of it. But it's union who decides.
Thank you.
No, but I didn't finish.
I'm afraid you had 3 points and other people want to get in, so I'd ask you to respect the chair. Thank you. I'd like to take this lady here.
Just very simply, where's the money going to come from? That's my question.
Can we take this gentleman over here?
Thank you.
You answer for the money.
In the instance of the Pfizer vaccine negotiation between the European Commission and the Pfizer boss, Albert Bourla, the European Court of Justice has asked, or a European court, depending on that, has asked the EU Commission President to release the SMS she did not want to release. This has not happened yet. It's been months ago. So doesn't the EU start to look like a banana republic?
Okay, thank you very much. Philip, would you like to pick up on any of those questions to start with?
Sure. Would it be okay if I react to the gentleman? And
yes.
Okay, excellent.
And then me too.
So.
Then me too.
Okay. Then just on your second and your third point. The third, then, the way that I said it was perhaps misunderstandable. I also wrote it the way that you describe it in the report. It is a competence that the European Union can use, and the member states cannot stop it from doing so according to the treaties. But so long as the EU does not do that, the national legislation is the one that regulates those areas of shared competence. So that's what I meant by the sentence earlier. And for the ever closer union, very good point that it has been introduced as the ever closer union of peoples. It's of the idea of pacifying the European continent, which is a very sensible aim, of course. Now, the ever closer union of the 1950s, when you had no international institution to begin with, you had to create it, you had to design the institutional setup of the treaties. It has evolved. It has also evolved through the judicial decisions by the European Court of Justice. So ever closer in the 1950s and 60s obviously meant something very different than in the 2010s and 20s, when we have already grown over decades. For instance, the acquis communautaire, an enormous body of common norms that nobody overseas understands because it's somewhere in the millions. So I'd say the more basic point of the ever closer union is that it has lost its purpose, and it has never been a proper purpose to begin with. The question is, ever closer union, what for? It's a functional aim, if you will, but not an ethic one or a political one in the proper sense. The drive for peace in Europe, now that is a proper political aim, and the ever closer union was conceived to be one appropriate means to doing so. And it has become, in a way, technocratized by the supranational level, and it is now something which is, well, yeah, in a way, like riding a bicycle. You just ever closer in the treaty, so ever closer, ever closer, ever closer, without proper reflection. Do we actually do any good to the higher purpose of European peace and European unity by becoming ever closer in areas where there's conflict between the various cultures on moral issues, on national identity, and similar things? So if ever closer might have been, and I think has been, a proper, a good idea in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it has become detrimental in our current state, and we should recalibrate where we're going with this. Just those 2 points.
Great. Michael?
I want to maybe ask a question back to you. I mean, you ask, absolutely, we say what's not working. But let's assume we decide all that next year, maybe in spring, because we have so many troubles, we some people in the parliament or other people come together, maybe you, and we want to write a manifesto, not more than 3 pages, no, because that people can read it, in which we say, you know, this is a type of European cooperation, not union, cooperation it should be. What should be the ideal things? And I haven't seen anybody, I'm coming completely from an outside world, now, I mean, for me, Europe is almost a foreign country. What is it actually? And I haven't felt any deputies I speak to even willing to form a group and somehow give some consideration. What are these 5, 6, 7, whatever basic principles on how we European states want to work together? We can complain all the time. We know it's not working. So it would be a time somehow that we have to come with some manifest. Could we come with something across party lines? Would the SPD work with us? Probably not. I mean, but I think the argument would be the important thing, something to issue, yeah.
Ms. Boyer?
Yes, I would like to reflect on the 3 questions. So, proposals. We didn't go into proposals, but we have some proposals. Actually, we already started this thinking during the conference on the future of Europe, and we had many meaningful, meaningful proposals. And what I can say, we have really thought about it carefully. And for example, the red card procedure or the green card procedure, these are all the things that we've been talking about this, even with the UK before Brexit. So you remember, because you were the chairman of AFCO committee, I worked actually 16 years in the European Parliament, so I know very well this institution. So we were thinking about that already a long time ago, how to make the subsidiary principle actually functioning, because the problem is that it's not really working now. So maybe to introduce new procedures like the red card procedure or a green card procedure. Then the catalogue of competencies. This can be something when we can clearly define and then avoid the gray zones, and we can clearly define which are the national states' competencies that must stay there, because this is basically touches upon the most fundamental sovereignty of the member states. And the competence courts, I mentioned this briefly. Yes, that could be also something that means will bring maybe legal clarity, but obviously we have to see what kind of judges are there. And then another thing on the subsidy principle, I was thinking about that. We already have an option that we don't really use, which is in the protocol number 2 and Article 8, that also governments and also member states, it's in the treaty, and also national parliaments can go to the court, basically, because of the subsidiary principle, for the breach of the subsidiary principle, and we don't really use that. So these are I think we have forward-looking proposals that we can think about it. And ever closer union, yes, another proposal, maybe we should delete it, and then there is no such a theological pressure basically towards that, because you are rightly said that the original principle was not meant to be like this, but in the end, as Philip said, in the end, the European institutions interpreted this towards more and greater, deeper integration and centralization. And this is not just the political rhetoric, this is sustained by institutional practices. So the Commission, for example, the Commission interprets its mandate as a continuous expansion. The European Parliament, you know it very well, basically pushes for institutionalization of its political preferences, and the Council is pushed to the corner and pressured to accept measures that go beyond the treaty. So it is the reality, actually, even if it was not the original vision. And what was the third question? SMSs, yes, this is what I was referring, that Article 2 of the TU should also entail a review of the European institutions' rule of law practices, like the Commission opaque system of which SMSs are to be deleted and which are not, and also the European Parliament internal rules, breach of their internal rules, while certain groups, they are not entitled to get the positions that they should under the rules of procedure of the European Parliament.
Thank you. Back out to the audience. I have this gentleman here, in the green. Yes.
I have a question, but first I'd like to thank MCC Brussels for producing these reports, and especially the ones on censorship. I think these are really important, because I think censorship and propaganda are the more effective, the less people are aware of them. And right now, I think the vast majority of Europe is not aware of the extent of the censorship and propaganda taking place. I would also like to thank Michael for inviting Jeffrey Sachs to speak at the European Parliament. That was a great move against the censorship of that kind of message. But my question, I sometimes refer to the EU as the EU-SSR. Now, do you guys see any similarities between the European Union and the way it's unfolding its laws and the way the Soviet Union practiced law?
Okay, thank you. Over here.
Thanks. Hi, Jacob Reynolds from MCC Brussels. It's not that I disagree with anything that the panelists have said, because I think it's been quite astute, but I think we do miss a little bit of getting to the kind of real root of part of the crisis. And it's not just that the EU kind of is on like a train on a runaway track, and it has taken on a life of its own, and the centralized institutions and bureaucracies are kind of amassing more power for its own sake. But it's also because right across Europe, elites, even those who like to sometimes criticize the EU, find it convenient to resolve disputes at the level of the European Union. And they find it far more convenient when things are decided by Brussels and they have to implement them, especially when they're unpopular at home. And so part of this is not just about the kind of the increasing amount of power that's amassed at the EU level. It's the lack of power that's exercised at the national level. It's the fact that we have been unable to hold our elites and our politicians properly to account, and that they are so kind of increasingly afraid of what's going on at home, unable to win the argument, lacking legitimacy at home, that they find it easier and more necessary to kind of do things at the EU level. Like, even, for example, Emmanuel Macron will one day be bemoaning the fact that the EU's introduced anti-AI legislation with the AI Act, and then the next day be demanding more and more power for the EU. So it's really about returning this question to the level of the nation state, demanding accountability from our politicians, as it is about just blaming the EU.
Thank you. This gentleman here at the front.
Yes, my name's David Price. I'm a journalist and a historian. I edit the Schuman project on the origin, purpose, and future of the European Community supranational system. And I'd like to explain in simple terms why we had this mission creep, which I call a democracy creep, an under-democracy creep, and it's now reached very serious levels, which I think you've been very kind to what's been going on, because we've had referendums which have been ignored. We now have huge debts of nearly a trillion euros, which were never, the whole system was forbidden to have debts in the past. And we have all sorts of things going on, like people being put in power behind closed doors in secret councils. The origin of this actually was mischief which was done in the French Foreign Ministry way back in 1950. The original Treaty of Paris defined all the institutions, the 5 institutions. And it also, Schuman made clear that there was another article which described how humans should have proper privileges, and that was called what he called the Charter of the Community. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the officials of the French Foreign Ministry, who were told by Article 100 of the treaty to send copies of all the documents to all the member states, refused to send this document to all the member states. So we have a treaty starting off which didn't have this charter in, which is equivalent to the Magna Carta, which said that all the human rights should be subject to the Convention of Strasbourg. Mm-hmm. So the nation could be preserved if the nation could appeal to Strasbourg. Mm. The organizations could appeal to them. The only organization in Europe at the moment which is not allowed to appeal to the Strasbourg is the European Union, which is quite considerable, amazing. This has gone on for a long period of time. The Treaty of Lisbon, which was actually introduced against referendums, has an article in it which says that the European Union must acknowledge the Convention of Human Rights. And this is the solution to your problem.
Okay.
That the politicians should insist that the European Union is acknowledges and is subject to the Court of Strasbourg.
Thank you. Philip, I just want to pick up what Mr. Price there said, because he's suggesting that the origin of the problem goes way back to the 1950s. And therefore, that what you see with the European community and the European Union, with the mission creep, is something that's built in. So therefore, should we be all that surprised when some nation states actually say that, you know, that they're finding the overreach too much, that really, should it be that much of a surprise? It's built in anyway.
That doesn't make it legitimate.
No.
So, in a way, you can argue that it is built in, and it is, in fact, you can find it in the either the conversations or the letters of Schuman and of Monnet, that they both consider that the way that they designed the cooperation on steel and coal cannot function unless it is extended. So it is, in a way, misdesigned from the beginning to allow for what we call now competence creep. So that is, in a way, built in from the very beginning. But that doesn't mean that there was something like half a dozen treaty, really not just changes, but really new negotiations on treaties since the ECSC. So that doesn't, let's say, absolve the national governments of their responsibility or perhaps the blame. They had several opportunities to stop that in the formulation that they decided on in the treaties and that they themselves signed. The ever closer union has been pulled through. All the way up to the Treaty of Lisbon. It would have been possible if you get the majority if the governments agree to it and can get to a common position on this, to kick out the ever closer union or to change whatever else in the treaties. They are the masters of the treaties. So, and that speaks to the point of national governments being, I would say it's a mix of lack of understanding creativity and perhaps laziness. This has gone well for a decade, for 2 decades, for 4 decades, so let's keep on this track. And at some point, it's not workable anymore, and I think this is where we are.
Yeah, Michael, I really want to pick up on that point with you. The fault or the problem, is it that the Commission is overreaching, or is it that the nation states, the governments in nation states, are not truly representing the demos, not truly representing the interests of the people in their countries when they fold so easily?
I don't think, I don't know, I mean, I've hardly ever lived in Europe, to say the truth, I mean, but what, I think it's neither one, I spontaneously, I think it's that we don't know what we want. What do we want? How do we want to live together? We want to take more and more states in. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Greenland, if possible. I mean, we want to become this big thing. But what do we want with this? I mean, why do we think that we want to create, in a multipolar world, to be the second at par with China and the United States, a superpower? Is this what we want? That's why we invest so much now in military and say we have to prepare for a war and things like this one? Or is it something we want to do more for our citizens, want to build more that what is distinguished to us, that we have a better social system than probably any other continent and things like this, that we have a culture, enormous diversity? It starts already with the building I go into. I always, when I go into this European Parliament building, I wonder if I'm in China or somewhere else. It has no element of anything of European culture in this one. I mean, we have such a rich architecture, and I go in this building and I always flee as much as I can because I find it so awful. So if you ask me already, architecture says always a lot about people because that's what architects do, and so we have no vision for it.
Yes,
we have a technocratic building. There's always
Ms. Boya, can I ask, to take more seriously the question about the USSR, is that one of the reasons that Hungary has such a desire for self-determination, for making its own direction, that having lived under the Soviet system, that you basically want to ensure that it's Hungarians who make the essential decisions about their lives?
Well, certainly we had an experience of almost 50 years, but also before our history is about survival. So to understand why we are a freedom fighter, actually, do you hear me? We fight for the freedom, and actually this is what we've been doing for centuries. Just to come back to the question that actually you posed also to Michael about the demos. So the government, the Hungarian government, the Prime Minister, actually is listening to the people and is listening to the citizens. So we have, for example, on every major issue, we have a national consultation, and then the Prime Minister goes to the European Council and defends this position. And sometimes he is alone, but he doesn't say that this is Brussels or who decided about what. No, he is defending the Hungarian interest and actually the citizens' interest and the citizens' choice. And that's why, I guess, also he is elected with two-thirds majority from time to time. And this is also why Brussels want to change this government so much. It uses every opportunity, every kind of coercion tool and method, and funds, suspension of funds, political and financial conditionality and pressure, because they want to change this government, because this government doesn't do what Brussels dictates. This government does what the people and the citizens would like to.
Okay. Frank.
Yeah.
Could you get the microphone up here,
I think
please?
there's a bit of a myth.
Stereo.
A bit of a myth that a lot of my friends also share. And the myth is that when the EU was founded by the fathers, they were the good guys. Right? And the fathers, wanted sovereignty. They wanted, a genuine commitment to national independence. But actually, when you look at the writings of someone like Schuman and all the other ones, they were very much into the idea of a federalist Europe, and the idea that somehow there was a golden age, and now there is something that's been the fall, needs to be looked at again by people actually reading what they've written, rather than accepting their myth. The question I've got, which is something that I hate asking because it's really been bugging me ever since I've been here in Brussels for the last 3 years, is does anybody in this room think that the EU can be reformed? Because that seems to be the assumption that it is possible to make these changes. I haven't got an answer to that. The one thing I do know is that the European courts cannot be reformed. Right? The European courts are irrevocably consisting of people that are committed to a federalist impulse. Their education as lawyers in different universities is critical legal theory, and they love what they're doing, and you can tell in advance what kind of decisions they're going to make, because they're essentially political actors masquerading as judicial independence. So I don't think that can be reformed. But can we think about reforming the EU by some kind of political means?
I'm going to give the panel the opportunity to answer that question, starting with you.
Okay. Yes. Well, yes, you are right. But if you think about De Gaulle, I don't think that he was really into a federalist idea, and Schuman. Yeah, well, yes, and Schuman was more interested in preserving Christianity in Europe, I think, than federalism. Reform, yes, actually there is a treaty reform on the table. I always refer to the Conference of the Future of Europe, maybe because I was responsible for that in Hungary, but you know that the European Parliament initiated the treaty reform, and it is still at the European Council, and obviously they don't really want to deal with it, but at a certain point the question will come, and we as Hungarians, we have answers and we have proposals. So to be reformed, maybe it's possible, but with a normal treaty reform procedure, meaning that in the end it's ratification and unanimity. Judicial reform, yes, well, obviously there is judicial activism, let's put it diplomatically. And yes, the Court of Justice, instead of interpreting the law, it is now basically creating and shape it, and this is not its role. And just a little reminder, I don't know whether you heard about it, it was last week, Monday, when the president of the Court of Justice basically gave a speech, and it was a kind of a political speech referring to Hungary, but he didn't say it. So here we are. This is exactly the problem, because these are not democratically elected persons. Here, judges should be there to interpret the law and to basically provide legal clarity, but they don't do it because they are doing the judicial activism that Philip was talking about.
Thank you. So, can it all be reformed, Michael?
I think it's a wrong question. It must be reformed, and it will be reformed because of the pressure that will be created when the Ukraine war is lost. I mean, nobody wants apparently to speak about the Ukraine war, but I tell you that's a big elephant in the room. What happens there will have an impact on the European Union. Look at this, the deficits, the Schulden, what is it, the debts we have taken on this war, this preparation for another war. I mean, with tanks, German tanks don't work in Ukraine, but we produce them now in the hundreds and things like this one. I mean, the deindustrialization of Germany, Macron, I think he has an approval rating of 11%. Starmer, of course, he's not EU, but it will have an impact if they have an economic collapse. And Merz, he's now below 30% in Germany, and we always approve our prime ministers because we are not French or not Italian. But this time, it's the lowest approval rating ever since the foundation of the European Union. So we are in big trouble.
We must be reformed, as you
the European Union will hit the wall, and it will also be, citizens will be upset about these things and things like this one. So it will come. So we better think about what type of European Union we want to have in the future to be prepared for it.
Thank you.
But nobody wants to listen to me.
Philip. Philip. Is reform possible, Philip?
Well, in theory, it certainly is. Maybe. I think it's, among other things, a question of where do you allocate your resources. It needs time, attention, and energy, and so long as the system is still an inch away from failure, you don't put energy and time into reforming it at that deeper level at which it needs to be reformed. And then to take the longer-term perspective, eventually the EU will be gone. I mean, every state, every empire, every corporation over human history has appeared and disappeared. So sooner or later this is going to happen. And I think the question is rather if we can reform it soon enough and profoundly enough to keep it working in our lifetime, or if we don't. So I think that Frank's pessimism comes from the fact that having seen how reform unwilling the institution here is, because of lag, or what you would call it, that I share that sentiment. I think that it would be reformed if pressure was so high that you see that you have either the possibility of reform or the possibility of failure. And when you really see that, when enough decision makers and enough peoples in Europe see this, then it might happen. And if not, I'd still argue that we've learned to live together relatively well, and there are fallback, what you call safe, well, it's not really a safety net, but assume the EU is gone someday, we might still have the European political community, more informal, more conversational, so maybe we can coordinate for this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've reached the end of our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I think tonight's discussion revealed something fundamental. Europe's crisis is not only political, it is also constitutional. We have heard how judicial interpretation, administrative innovation, and shifting human rights law have all contributed to a system that expands the European Union's power while often bypassing democratic oversight. And that is something that should be of concern to all of us.
We have very few.
We are going to, on behalf of MCC Brussels, I'd like to thank our speakers and to all of you for joining us. I'd like to invite you to join us for a drink at the reception. It'll be in the club restaurant, which is, as you go back to where you enter the building, you will take a left hand turn and you'll go up the stairs. Please join us for a drink there, and let's continue this conversation. Thank you all very much.
Vladimir.